told them when I got here. Okay, I explored the criminal lifestyle, but I was an altar boy, for Christ's sake. Moltisanti is a religious name, and still I'm f***ed. I met death on...
So I saw The Many Saints of Newark, and it was pretty good, though I'll confess not the movie I was expecting. The trailers sold it as a Tony Soprano origin story, but the film begins and ends years before that fateful night Tony fell into the vat of radioactive marinara sauce and became the Soprano. I feel like we've been hearing about a potential follow-up to The Sopranos for years now, basically since the show ended. Rumors about a sequel movie, a prequel series, a spin-off series, but when The Many Saints of Newark was finally announced, it almost felt like there was an air of trepidation leading up to the release. You know, a lot of people expressing anxieties that the movie would be a cash grab or something that tarnishes the legacy of the show, and it was certainly neither of those, but I can also see how anyone going in expecting a feature-length episode of The Sopranos might be disappointed, because it's definitely not that either. I mean, it is a part of The Sopranos, immersed in it. The writing, the characters, their dialogue and affectations, we are very much back in that world, thanks to just some incredible acting from everyone involved. Most of the praise has been focused on Michael Gandolfini and Vera Farmiga, but even the people with only a few moments of screen time did such a good job bringing the younger iterations of their characters to life. Syl, Paulie, Carmela for the few moments she had. Just look at this girl, this is so Janice! But as much as the film is steeped in the world of The Sopranos, it doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the show. I mean, if you haven't seen the series, don't watch it, because it spoils major plot elements, like, immediately. Last chance.
The little fat kid is my uncle, Tony Soprano. He choked me to death.
That said, if you're expecting The Many Saints of Newark to address the show's unanswered questions or reveal what happens to Tony after Made in America's cut to black, it doesn't. In fact, the one real mystery from The Sopranos that the movie does answer is basically played as a joke, but we'll get to that. Even more so than a direct prequel, I'd say The Many Saints of Newark is largely something that's responding to The Sopranos, specifically to this romanticized image of the old guard we were so often exposed to throughout the show. The first episode opens with Tony meeting Dr. Melfi and describing the sense of unease he's experiencing coming in at the end of a golden age, and we're always hearing about how much more reliable people were before the RICO statutes, how much more dignified, more honorable they were in the Godfather days of yore. The Many Saints of Newark tells us that the family were the same petty, uncouth, disgusting slobs back then that they were by the late 90s.
The door opens and the donkey starts kicking and shitting over everybody in the party. Oh!
Ray Liotta is phenomenal in both roles he plays, Hollywood Dick and Sal Moltisanti. Finally seeing him as part of this world was so cool, and he really is the perfect actor to convey the respective points the film is making with each character.
Giuseppina, what does your family do over there?
Mio padre.
The fascists killed her old man. Her mother never recovered. Fucking Mussolini.
I don't get it. When I was a kid, you and Vito Genovese, you always praised Mussolini.
Let's not talk politics at the table.
The Mussolini line is interesting for a few reasons, because this is a thing that really does happen. Hitler was elected to power, but nobody in Germany would admit to having voted for him in the decades following the war. But also because glorifying or idealizing the past is something that's been inherent to every fascist movement, from the literal Nazis to political groups like the Golden Dawn or the Republican Party of today. And that's not me inserting my own politics into the material. Tony and Carmela are heavily coded in a way that critiques white, socially conservative baby boomers. The sort of people who think America used to be one giant Thomas Kincaid painting as envisioned by Billy Graham until the 1960s came along and ruined everything. Tying the family's politics back to the literal National Fascist Party of Italy is a deliberate choice, and honestly, I think the reason some fans of the show have responded so poorly to The Many Saints is because of how much more blunt the film makes its political statements.
Go ahead, sir. He's right.
But that's something we'll get into at a later date. At times, I feel like the movie is consciously playing with the idea of the past not necessarily being the way we're told it was, or even the way we remember it to be. There are multiple scenes that were described or even shown in The Sopranos via flashbacks that play out differently in the movie, like the incident where Johnny assaults Livia with a gun, or the time Tony saw the police arrest his father and shoot another man while he was running away. I'm tempted to call this a continuity error, an oversight by the filmmakers, but I really don't think that's the case, because Tony sees sees the guy get shot in 2 different places, but both versions comment specifically on the injured body part, as if drawing attention to the disparity. I think this is saying something about memory not always being a perfect indicator of the past, because the events we recall are filtered not just through the media we consume, but through our own preconceptions as well, and biases that shift and morph as we age farther and farther from the people who experienced these events to begin with. We think of something as having happened one way, and that's the story we tell ourselves again and again, and that's what everything before right now is, this accumulated story we keep telling ourselves. One of my favorite Sopranos moments is in the season 4 opener, For All Debts Public and Private, when Christopher, after years of thinking his father was shot carrying his crib, finds out it was actually a TV tray and immediately updates the mythology to keep it about himself.
Are you inferring that you didn't take cash from Jilly Ruffalo to whack my father while he was carrying a TV tray for me to watch TV?
I think it's natural to idealize the past. For most people, life is easier when they're a child. Your friends and family are still around, there's no bills or a job to worry about, and life just has a way of wearing you down the longer it goes on for. It's like the song says, what a drag it is getting old. But judging people as a collective, life has mostly gotten better for most people over time. Crime rates, global poverty, medical science, art, and human decency in general have only improved over the past several decades, just like they've improved over the past several hundred years, just like they've been improving since we climbed down out of the trees and started applying meaning to the monkey bark sounds we make. When fascists and reactionaries fetishize a past that never existed, when they talk about degeneracy or social decay, what they're really doing is manipulating childhood nostalgia to shit on progressive values that are objectively designed to make life better for people.
You remember the crazy hair? And the dope? Now it's in the military.
Stop it, Junior. You're making me very upset.
Set during the 1967 Newark race riots, the film juxtaposes the justified anger of New Jersey's black community being beaten and robbed and murdered by militarized police with the impotent, almost childlike rage of white men like Dickie Moltisanti and Johnny Boy Soprano.
That's Poupette's house.
What are you mad at me for?
Hey!
It's funny how triggered white conservatives got a few months ago when U.S. Army General Mark Milley, a person who is literally immersed in war and violence for a living, talked about wanting to understand white rage, because this is the kind of thing non-white people have had to deal with for years. And I'm not just talking about the overt hostility of conservative quote-unquote news, but this pandering shit that liberal media does too, where they treat black poverty as this lurid entertainment spectacle, even while they push the same policies and agendas that prop up the systems of white supremacy and de facto racial segregation permeating our cities, our institutions, and our education systems to this day. They called it the long hot summer, but the issues that led to the violence and chaos of '67 went a lot further back than that. Back to non-white soldiers being denied the GI Bill when they got home from World War II, and to bank loans being flat denied to neighborhoods occupied predominantly by people of color, to predatory real estate policies that forced black people into renting property from white landlords in ghetto neighborhoods while white families opened up small businesses and moved to the suburbs. And since schools are primarily paid for by local property taxes, and since in our capitalist system income is heavily tied to education, the result is a continuation of America's long tradition of racial segregation designed to disadvantage people of color, cyclically reinforced by white cowardice and the complicity of a corrupt media that exists to prop up the owner class.
That fall, Johnny moved to the suburbs, the black thing. And he was seriously earning. This move made Tony half a pussy in my estimation.
Seriously, having Christopher narrate from beyond the grave was just an amazing call. The scene where Johnny's being sentenced all stoic while Livia cries super loud, making herself the center of attention, is funny, but it's also very significant that he was angrier about a black family having moved onto his block than he was about going to prison. We can call our news propaganda, and make no mistake, it is, but it wouldn't be so effective if this issue weren't such an emotional vulnerability to so many cisgendered American white men. Of course, white rage is a thing. It's basically the theme of the movie.
That was an overreaction.
The film's thesis is all about how ugly violence is in real life, how even when used against a violent person, it's still a selfish indulgence that only makes things worse. Dickie comes at the situation with his father like he's defending a woman or doing something heroic, but he's really just using that as an excuse to lash out violently against the source of trauma he's lived with since he was a child. In a lot of ways, the film's treatment of Dickie Moltisanti parallels what the show was saying with Tony Soprano, which does make sense. Throughout the series, Tony's always referring to Dickie as his mentor, the person who most made him the man he is.
Motherfucker.
Like Tony, Dickie survived childhood abuse that's left him prone to rages and a kind of self-pitying narcissism, and, like Tony, he's a hypocrite. A violent, selfish criminal who wants to think of himself as the good guy, the put-upon hero of the story. He confronts his father about kicking Josepina down the stairs, then reacts like 10 times more violently when the old man says something that triggers his childhood trauma. Then he flips out at his crew for disrespecting the funeral of the father he killed with an outburst that creates way more of a disruption than their TV watching had. Then there's this beautiful little cross hypocrisy towards the end where he beats the shit out of one of his friends for making a sexual comment about his girlfriend.
I love her.
Shortly before he kills her with his own hands, crying out in rage over the murder of the same man Dickie was beating during his last moments of life. And that's not even the deepest hypocrisy being revealed in this scene. Tony and Carmela are specifically written to represent conservative baby boomers and to exemplify the various social and political hypocrisies thereof.
His father, my grandpa, come into the country originally through Montreal, illegally.
No kidding. You wasn't Ellis Island, your grandfather?
Nah, got mixed up in some shenanigans on the other side. Anti-government or something. Had a police record. They ought to build a wall now, though. I'm telling you.
Amen.
But Dickie Moltisanti is something else. He's not coded as conservative, at least not for the 1960s. He's childhood friends with a black man, he calls out his dad's politics and listens to liberal radio programs, he has a little chuckle at the cops being fucked up. Dickie wants to think of himself as open-minded, maybe even progressive, in the same way he probably told himself he was doing something noble when he threw that first punch at his father. He wants to believe he's more tolerant than the Neanderthals he spends his time with, but when he finds out his girlfriend had an affair with a black man, he turns as vile and ugly as any of them. Because it is a prejudice that goes bone deep in this country. I think Josepina told Dickie about Harold because she wasn't an American and had no idea how much more danger it put her in to reveal it was a black guy she'd been sleeping with.
If I don't love you anymore, you won't mistake it for a maybe.
Of course, it would be incorrect to say these criticisms weren't present in The Sopranos. They were, just expressed a little bit differently. In a lot of ways, this feels like the more mature, more empathetic expression of those points. I kept waiting for something really terrible to happen to Harold or his family to show how fucked things are, which is kind of how The Sopranos would typically do things. And the point was made, but not in a way that felt like it took dignity away from people of color like it sometimes did on the show. At least insofar as I can see. There's obviously always going to be aspects of this stuff I'm blind to.
You believe this? How these people prey on their own?
This line made me laugh the first time I watched the movie because Junior tries to have Tony killed in the first season of The Sopranos over something super trivial, then it made me laugh the second time as well.
That's right, we're talking about you, you cagey fuck.
Huh?
You got him all fooled.
And what really surprised me about the film, especially considering the way it was advertised, is how empathetic the Many Saints of Newark is to Tony himself, and in a way that really made this feel like the perfect closing point for the story. After how dark and cynical season 6 of the show was, it felt right that we ended on a final look at Tony's innocence. We see glimpses of the man he'd one day grow into, but he's still a child. He still has that spark of goodness. When he breaks the rules, it seems more mischievous than evil, you know? This was a Tony who still had the chance to be good. And it's not just Tony either.
He told me about a night your husband was away. You got into bed with Anthony and hugged him.
He said that?
No, his exact words were you snuggled up close. Yeah, I remember that now. You read to him from that book. Long into the night, apparently. He remembered details. He didn't know the word ingot, and you explained it to him. He said it was one of his best memories of his life.
I never would have imagined in a million years that Livia Soprano would almost be getting tears out of me in 2021, but here we are. I got really choked up during the scene in the principal's office and after when Livia makes Tony a burger and they talk about Ellaville. It's such a sweet and beautiful scene and just devastating if you've ever known or cared about someone who suffered from mental illness they were unwilling or unable to treat.
Keep on running for the shelter of a mother's little helper.
What?
It's a song. It's by the Stones.
Exactly what I'm talking about. They're drug addicts. I don't take drugs.
The song's not saying that you take drugs. It's...
The part where Tony starts to explain the Stones song, then cuts himself off, is genuinely heartbreaking because they came so close to understanding each other. The song he's referencing, Mother's Little Helper, is about how hard life is on women, especially housewives and mothers who are aging out of what society tells them is their sexual prime, and how in the 1950s and 60s they were all abusing Valium to get through the day and take care of their ungrateful families. So it's like Tony is thinking about the song and his mom, and he almost got her in that moment. And if he'd been able to explain it, she would have known that her son just that once really saw her and everything that she had to deal with that turned her into the person she was. Would that have made things different between the two of them? Maybe not by that point, but it can still mean a lot to be seen by someone you're close with, even just for a moment. Vera Farmiga did such a good job bringing the character back to life, giving us this look at still Livia Soprano, but one who hadn't been whittled down by life to just her fears and resentments. Everybody did a great job with what they were given, but she and Michael Gandolfini really were the standouts, both giving such a beautiful look at the humanity inside what would become such mean-spirited, despicable characters. It makes me think of that moment in the show after her funeral when Christopher gets really high and stumbles onto Nietzsche's Doctrine of Infinite Return, which Carmela waves off as inebriated ramblings, but is actually a really kind of profound way of dealing with grief and with the futility that life can just wreck you with sometimes.
They say there's no two people on earth exactly the same. No two faces, no two sets of fingerprints. But do they know that for sure? Because they would have to get everybody together in one huge space. And obviously that's not possible, even with computers. Mrs. Soprano may have passed, but who's to say there isn't another Mrs. Soprano just like her, or will be? Maybe not with the same fears and paranoia, but the same.
Alternate universes?
Are you gonna be a fucking comedian now?
I'm not.
The Many Saints of Newark is about innocence as much as it is about rage, how beautiful it is even with and perhaps because of the inevitability of its loss. Of course, as much as the movie does take a more compassionate approach to its characters, there's less patience than ever for the rationalizations of violent con men like Tony Soprano and Dickie Moltisanti.
Your poor father, huh? He goes down to board up that attaboy business that he had. And he dies in that horrible way. So much tragedy in your life. Your father, your mistress. What kind of God, huh?
Sally Moltisanti may have been my favorite character in the movie. He's kind of like the Jennifer Melfi of the Many Saints of Newark, but rather than a surrogate mother figure, he represents the replacement father Dickie seeks out after he murders his own. And where Melfi always had this nurturing, kind of indulgent attitude towards Tony, half charmed and half in fear of his explosive tantrums, Sal sees through all of Dickie's bullshit immediately and just has no patience for it whatsoever, giving him none of the cheap affirmations he's come looking for. To the point where he actually gets up and walks away while Dickie's in the middle of this clearly made-up self-aggrandizing story about teaching beep baseball to blind kids. But the comparison the film more directly invites us to make is with his brother. Everything about Sal is in direct contrast to his twin, right down to their affectations and the way they carry themselves. While Dick Sr. was a disgusting slob who wiped his mouth on the tablecloth and flew into hysterics over sanitary products, Sal is like this vegan Chad.
I don't eat dairy.
Who accepts his situation and eschews earthly desires all enlightened and Buddhisty, completely unfazed by Dickie's bribes and attempts at manipulation. Sally, if you didn't get it, is Gary Cooper, the strong, silent type, this masculine ideal that Tony's upheld his entire life that he so bemoans the loss of to his doctor and anyone who will listen. So what the movie's saying by his utter rejection of Dickie is that this guy has no use whatsoever for this guy, and my God, Ray Liotta looks like an ape.
As far as your nephew goes, may I make a brief suggestion for a nice Christmas present you could give him?
I'm listening.
Stay out of his life.
The last thing he says to Dickie, it's actually quite good advice, and he should have followed it, because Tony does start to get away from the mob after Dickie breaks off contact with him. Cutting someone out of your life can be hard, especially if you genuinely care about that person, but if the dynamic is toxic, then sometimes it's just the right thing to do. Nobody's really born under a bad sign. We're all the way life makes us. And it wasn't Dickie's death that set Tony on the path to becoming a man who'd strangle the son of the person he looked up to and loved so much as a boy. It was Dickie reaching back out through Syl and reestablishing that connection.
I know I shouldn't say this, but Anthony, he could end up somewhere. Beyond this thing of ours, even.
Tell him the host is tomorrow.
The Many Saints of Newark is all about that father-child dynamic and the ways in which it influences us throughout our entire lives. Dickie's relationships with Tony and with Sal and his own father, the film bringing us eyeball to eyeball with how small and inattentive the great Johnny Boy Soprano was as a parent, not to mention Michael Gandolfini and all that entails. Something I found especially affecting was Dickie using the same nickname for Tony that Tony calls AJ throughout the show. He even uses it in their final scene together in Halston's.
$5 says I spot him first.
I don't got $5.
You better win, Gooch. Where's the Gooch?
The shot of young Tony sitting in that same restaurant, the hope in his eyes looking out at the window waiting for his Uncle Dickie to show up when we know he's not going to, it's all just so heartbreaking. It's like his childhood innocence died in the place where the man himself would eventually die. I actually laughed out loud after Dickie's death scene when we see Junior hobbling to the phone booth. It's always been treated like this great mystery by fans of the show who killed Dickie Moltisanti, right up there with what happened to the Russian guy in Pine Barrens. Was it really the cop Christopher kills as revenge? If not, was Tony lying to manipulate him? Did Tony kill Dickie himself? That after all these years, it turned out to have been that fucking prick Junior because Dickie laughed at him when he fell down the stairs is so funny I can't even be disappointed. And it's entirely in keeping with the character.
Man is driven in toto by his insecurities.
The ending is sad, but bittersweet, I think. Knowing he was the one person Livia probably would have listened to, it's tragic finding out Dickie had bottles of Elavil in his pocket, seeing the hope and eagerness in Tony's eyes looking out that window, but it's also kind of beautiful. Tony looks so lost in that final scene, staring down at Dickie's body while Frank Sinatra's Whatever Happened to Christmas plays, and then he imagines them locking pinkies again. A recreation of this private memory from his childhood that the two of them shared, something that was obviously very important to Tony, and now it's like Dickie's gone and he's the only one who remembers it happened. It's sad when moments like that pass into memory, knowing that there's a finite limit to the time we have with the people we love and that it's rapidly running out. Sad that we lose our innocence, but in a sense, it's like these moments exist forever. They're a part of what made us and the world we inhabit, and they're a part of every interaction we have thereafter. We know how the story ends for Tony, for Livia, for Janice, and we can't change that. But they weren't always the people they wound up as, and it's nice that we had this moment of humanity with them. The Sopranos has become famous for having one of the most memorable endings in the history of television, but I think this is the chapter I prefer the story to close on. It doesn't forgive Tony or Livia, but it encourages us to understand them. It closes the circle. Thank you for watching.